Emotionally healthy people crave this way more than sex. We're going to dive into this conversation today. Whether you're a man or woman, there's a big difference in the dating marketplace. If you're actually connecting with a person who has a relatively high emotional maturity versus those that have weak emotional maturity, weak relationship skills, or that are emotionally constipated or unavailable. And there's a big difference that we're going to differentiate also between those who are actually doing some work healing themselves versus those that have done little or no work, are object to doing any healing work. And I think it's radically important to understand this. And since my audience is midlife is after baby making years and before retirement. So if you're in the ages of 42 to 69, that's the predominant audience I speak to, and why this is so significantly different than those men or women in their 20s and 30s is oftentimes they are in a relationship to make babies and raise a family. Let me repeat this: make babies and raise a family, and they might have some different obstacles to attend to versus those of us in midlife. And we're going to dive into those obstacles as well. So for this conversation, I think it's important to know the three types of people who are actively in the dating marketplace. The three types of people that are actively in the dating marketplace. Please forgive this graph. And by the way, this is not a fact. It's merely an opinion. But I roughly say 20% of the populations are users. They seek short-term game. They're love bombers. They're players. They're gold diggers. They're entitled people. They're only in it for themselves. And while over here I say 20% of the population are grower builders, they seek long-term connection. They are emotionally healthy. They have their act together. The vast majority, roughly maybe about 60%, and again, this is not a fact, it's merely an opinion, are what I call spenders. And the reason why they're called spenders is they'll spend time with you. They want companionship. They want connection. They want that physical intimacy. But maybe their life is in chaos. Maybe they're unhealed from their childhood wounds or adult traumas. Maybe they're going through a significant divorce. They're basically not capable of being in a serious relationship. And I know many of you men and women out there watching this have experienced that person I call a spender. And again, they're spending time with you. You eventually become a placeholder in their life. You become a placeholder in their life. Listen, most people are good people. They don't intentionally want to hurt someone. We all, human beings, all crave some level of safety, emotional connection, of love. We want to feel safe with a partner. But for those who haven't done the inner work, the healing work, and again, I talk about childhood wounds and adult traumas. If you're not familiar with the book, The Hoffman Process, I highly recommend reading this so you can understand your own fears, insecurities, negative patterns, limiting beliefs. By the way, all the books I recommend are listed below. How your judgments might affect relationships, how you might be sabotaging relationships based on a childhood wound. I highly recommend reading this book. And then a follow-up to this would also be to understand your love attachment style. If you're not familiar with the book, Wired for Love by Dr. Stan Tack, and I highly recommend understanding how you might be choosing a partner from an insecure place. There's basically two types of love attachment styles. There's secure and insecure. Now, here's the fascinating thing about secures. Most people that, or let me reframe that. This is the fascinating thing about insecure people. And within insecure, there's something known as anxious, preoccupied, fearful avoidant, and dismissive avoidant. That's in the insecure category. What's fascinating about most human beings, they'll take the test online and they all come out, all the wounded people, all the insecure people, all seem to be secure. It fascinates me how we human beings gaslight ourselves. We're not really honest with ourselves on a really granular emotional level. Now, I will say most of these tests are rather simplistic. And because of that, it really doesn't go into the granular spaces within your past relationships, those periods of times where you might feel insecure, where we might pull away. And so Understanding this helps, and certainly healing these modalities within yourself actually better prepares you for a healthy relationship. And I'm going to talk about what men and women crave more than physical intimacy. Well, and I will say this, sex is an important part of the dating process because, oh, or let me reframe that, the whole part of the relationship process, because listen, you have relationships with people in your life. You have family members, you have friends, you have coworkers. But the one significant difference is that when you're in a romantic relationship, it usually includes sex. So that's an important part of the relationship. And we're going to talk about, in the next few months, we're going to talk a lot about the importance of sex in a relationship. So here's why midlife is so radically different than those in their 20s and 30s. You see, people in their 20s and 30s are oftentimes come to the table as a blank sheet of paper. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have childhood wounds, but they don't necessarily have a lot of luggage. I know it's called baggage, but I prefer to call it luggage. And some people, when they're traveling in their life, their luggage can fit in the overhead compartment on the airplane. And some people need 6 sky caps to put it on the plane. There are certainly things like distance that is an obstacle in the early stages of dating. These days, most people aren't meeting people right in their own backyard. Distance, proximity plays a factor. It can be an obstacle into building a deeper connection with another human being. Certainly those in midlife, some people are empty nesters, some people are still raising children. This can be a complication because your children are a big part of your life or a big part of someone else's life. And it could directly affect, it could be an obstacle in building a closer relationship with another person. Certainly lifestyle differences. I've noticed that, please forgive me, but in the dating marketplace as a single man, I see a lot of women who are hyper focused on physical activities. They're skiing, they're mountain biking, they're jumping out of airplanes, they're climbing mountains. And I'm like, that's not who I am. Our lives and the way I curate my life might be completely different the way someone else curates their life. And a lot of times lifestyle differences becomes a block to connecting. One of the most important blocks, and it's actually what we're going to dive in today, is a mismatch in love languages. And guess what? There's a lot more new information about love languages that goes far beyond what Gary Chapman talked about in his 5 love languages. Now, today, religion and politics can play a big role in differences in relationships. I would venture to say, at least here in the United States, someone who's radically conservative is probably not going to get along with someone who's radically liberal. And I think it's naive to suggest that politics and or our spiritual connection, our religion certainly can play a huge factor in connecting at a deep heart-centered level. Certainly health differences. I know here in Southern California, we tend to be a little bit more health conscious than other parts of the country, but I've spoken to women and men where health differences was the deal breaker. We call sometimes things the ick, but we're talking about a value difference when it comes to health, and that can play a huge role. And then earlier I talked about physical and sexual type. Everybody has their own sexual preferences, and we humans oftentimes naively go into the dating experience or go into sex just expecting that the man is going to be James Bond and he's going to be the most proficient lover on the planet. And certainly men, and by the way, in midlife, we are dealing with a lot of shame when it comes to our physical body and certainly our sexual capacity to be in relationship. These are some of the big obstacles we deal with. Certainly someone's individual passions in life can be a factor. And as I said earlier, emotional health and emotional readiness plays a huge role into whether or not 2 people are actually going to find a space of wanting something more than that physical intimacy. And lastly, their motives, desires, and vision. Do they have a short-term mating strategy or a long-term mating strategy? I would venture to say most men operate with a short-term strategy. Women oftentimes also operate from a short-term strategy, but in the back of their mind, they've been conditioned to desire commitment and safety. But believe it or not, the way they actually date, from what I've observed, is a very short-term strategy. And this is why in the dating marketplace, it's such chaos. This is one of the reasons why, at least here in the United States, we have over 100 million singles. You believe this? With one third of the population is single. One third of the population is probably doesn't, well, I don't know what the percentage of young people, but certainly we have a significant population of people that are not mated with one another for a variety of different reasons. And I will tell you, it's because many of them date from a short-term mating strategy. Sadly, this is where a lot of you ladies get hung up. You're seeking that man that will climb to the highest room of the tallest tower through romance and entertainment, and not the emotional maturity that you should be hyper-focused on, in my opinion, vetting for emotional maturity more so than being entertained or romanced in a relationship. So today we're going to explore some new content concerning what men and women crave more than sex in a relationship. And while physical connection is important, we're going to touch upon that. I'm actually going to share with you something I became aware of last year, known as the 7 love languages. The 7 love languages. I highly recommend Googling this right now. This is actually, it's kind of taking the principles from Gary Chapman's book, The 5 Love Languages, and expanding and adding new things. Expanding and adding new things, because ultimately an emotionally healthy person craves all 7 of these things. Let me repeat that. They crave all 7. This is the delusion let me reframe that. The misconception of the 5 love languages is some people only speak in one love language, and one person speaks in one love language and another person speaks another love language, and they're not connecting at that heart-centered level. They're not connecting at that heart-centered level. So I invite you to explore these for yourself and ask yourself, can you speak all of these love languages? Because this is what emotionally healthy men and women crave more than sex. And listen, write these down and see if this fits your narrative. Okay, the first one is activities. I even shared this before. Hobbies, travel, skiing. Some people, this is a high priority in their life. They crave this more than physical intimacy. I was sharing earlier how I've seen a lot of women's dating profiles. They're skiing, they're mountain biking, they're climbing mountains, they're skydiving. And I once connected with a woman locally, and this activities was her highest value. Now I'm all for doing activities, but it's not my highest value. It was a mismatch between us because I asked her, and she agreed. She needs a jock type of man in her life because this is such a passion. You see, here at Midlife, we want people that share our passions because we're not looking for roommates. We're not looking for a companion. We are actually looking for a partner. For most of us in midlife are actually looking for a play partner in the things that we're most passionate about to play together. This is why it's trying to fit a lot of square pegs in round holes kind of thing, because it's much harder for those of us in midlife. And let me tell you, any dating coach that says what you're doing is wrong, they're a crappy coach. I have to be careful because sometimes I do that too. So maybe I'm a crappy coach. But what I mean to say is, most dating coaches are encouraging you to compromise your life instead of finding someone who's aligned in your life. So if activities is one of your highest love languages, if it's one of your primary love language, then you have to find someone who meets that. Just because they might do acts of service, as Gary Chapman might say, might be a misalignment between the two of you. And activities falls into Gary Chapman's quality time, I would suspect. Number 2. Love language, appreciation. Emotionally, men and women want to be validated for their efforts. They want words. They want that expression of, I'm really grateful for you. I really appreciate your efforts. I can tell you a lot of women fail at this. Certainly men do as well. But I'm going to tell you, when I say fail, they are so weak in expressing validation and appreciation for efforts. Do you know men who go through divorce state that one of their number one disappointments is they didn't feel validated and appreciated for their efforts? I can speak from personal experience. That's how it was for me. And I know for many men, appreciation was rather lacking in their relationship. And so I want you to conscious before you go out on the next day, really lean into them for yourself. Number 3, emotional connection. Healthy expression of emotions. It's one of the primary reasons why women initiate divorce, because they're in relationship with emotionally constipated men, emotionally unavailable men, people that are avoidant attachment style. Remember, I talked about avoidant, whether they are fearful or dismissive avoidant. They lack that emotional maturity to be able to navigate, to be able to understand what they're feeling, and then be able to express it in a healthy way. If you haven't read the book, Emotional Intimacy by Robert Masters, I highly recommend checking this out. Emotionally healthy people are craving emotional connection. This is one of the fundamental aspects of a relationship, is your capacity to navigate your fears, your insecurities, your limiting beliefs, your doubts, your judgments, negative judgments for another, how your actions affect another human being. This is all in the context of self-awareness. And sadly, we have a population, at least here in the United States, that is rather robotic, rather transactional, because we're supposed to climb to the highest room of the tallest tower. That's what men are supposed to do. And that proves their worth. The capacity to speak on an emotional level should be a lot more valuable than whether a man or woman take you out to a nice dinner and entertain you. I've always said romance should be reserved as a gift of being in a relationship, not as an entry point into a relationship. Number 4, financial. It's interesting. That's a love language, is that capacity to support one another. But here's an interesting thing I've noticed within men. I have a dear friend of mine. He's incredibly wealthy, north of $50 million. And he was telling me the story. He's now engaged, but he was telling the story about one of his early dates with his now fiance. How she went up and paid for the dinner behind his back because she wanted to express appreciation. And while the appreciation, she put her money where her mouth is. I will tell you by the way, he happens to be rich, so he covers the entire relationship. But most divorced men feel a sense of pain on a financial level, and a woman and men contributing on a co-creative basis actually demonstrates partnership skills. And I can tell you, a lot of men, unless they're really tied into their ego, their machismo ego, they want a partner who will, both men and women want people to put their money where their mouth is to some degree. And that's just my interpretation of the financial love language. Now, the next one, number 5, is intellectual. Emotionally healthy people have curiosity beyond, how's your day going? Did you have a good day? I hope you had a good day. I know for myself, my passions are philosophy, psychology, human behavior, and spirituality. That's where my playground is. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the term sapiosexual, I can tell you that there are people out there that truly get off on literally almost on a sexual level when they're in the presence of someone where they can explore their curiosities in life. That's what it means to be an intellectual person, is to be curious beyond the surface. It's about being curious about emotions. It's about being curious about things instead of just experiencing life. Now, the 6th love language in these 7 love languages I'm sharing certainly is the physical, but I'm going to tell you a story. That is, physical doesn't have to be sex. I was on a date 5 or 6 years ago with a woman, and we were sitting at a bar, so we were actually turned face to each other, and my arm was at the bar, and I didn't notice
At one point, she was just doing this she was just touching me. It was kind of fascinating to me. We were Facebook friends, so she wasn't a total stranger. And I was like, I didn't notice at first. It was so subtle. I wasn't even paying attention. But when I finally noticed, I was like, wow, I appreciate this physical touch. And I remember I was out to have drinks with a dear friend of mine, Tammy, and I introduced her to a dear friend of mine, Dawn. And she did the exact same thing. It was just an unconscious, involuntary type of move. But I can tell you that simple physical touch is what we crave as much as we crave sexual intimacy as well. Now, the last one is going to be centered around what Gary Chapman calls the acts of service, but this is the practical components in a life. This is something where you're actually working as a team together. Maybe one person does the shopping and one person takes out the trash. It's those practical things in life that build. By the way, being good roommates with one another is hugely important for the success of a relationship. If you have that capacity to work well as a team, and not necessarily it's always one person doing more than the other. It's about doing it in a co-creative, collaborative type of experience. And this is known as the practical love language, or at least my interpretation of all this. Emotionally healthy men and women want physical intimacy. There's no doubt about it. But quite frankly, emotionally healthy men and women want these 7 love languages of activities, about appreciation, about emotional connection, about financial connection, about intellectual connection, physical connection, certainly, and lastly, the practical needs in life. And when you're experiencing that, most of the time, these are the relationships, are the juicy, delicious, healthy, happy relationships I talk about so frequently on my videos. Is this sinking in? Is this resonating with you? Please let me know. If it is, post a comment below. I'd like to hear your thoughts. As always, if you find value in my videos, please hit that like button. Please share this video. Please subscribe to my channel. Hit that notification bell so you can be notified of new videos. And also make sure that you hit it on your phone as well. Also, if you want to connect with me directly, there's links below to schedule a discovery call with me to see if working with a coach is right for you. There's a link to join my group called Midlife Love Mastery, where you can have direct access to me on a regular basis. There's a link to follow me on Instagram to get my dating vows, and all the books I recommend are listed in the show notes.